Well, this is a plant that Beckler collected, but not in the vicinity of the Darling River. He collected it during his second northern trek, when he went to retrieve the 2 Europeans who were stranded at Torrawatto Swamp. Now, the specimen that's in the herbarium, in fact, lacks the very part that is necessary to determine precisely what species it is, which is this sporangiocarp. This is a fern. It looks not very like a fern, but it is a fern. And so this brownish thing contains the sporangia, which contain the spores. So somehow or other, oh, and this is the very plant that when Beckler arrived, he found the 2 Europeans trying to subsist on, because they had learnt from the local Aborigines that if the spores are ground into a paste, they can be cooked. Remember, cooked, which Burke and Wills didn't do, cooked as a porridge or a cake, and then eaten. And they collected, they used it to pints. I think they had to collect about a pint, which is about 600 mils every day, of these things, which would have been a sort of slow job. But the herbarium specimen, the specimen that's still in the National Herbarium of Victoria, lacks, as I think I started to say, this fruiting body, the fern's sporangiocarp, and so the precise species of the particular nardoo that Beckler collected up at Torrawatto Swamp cannot accurately be determined. And I don't know whether Beckler just managed to get a specimen that didn't have this diagnostically important bit, or whether it somehow or other got lost in transition. But this is, I hope it's the same species. This is the nardoo that I think he collected at Torrawatto Swamp, and the Aboriginal guide said he knew it from the Darling River, so from this area, and gave him the Aboriginal name, which I'm sorry I have forgotten.
This plant here is black bluebush, Mariana pyramidata, which is one that Beckler collected on the expedition. And this is one of the most ubiquitous plants in the whole of the west of New South Wales and further into South Australia and Victoria. And there's whole landscapes known as bluebush plains that are dominated by this species. And adjacent to it we have a more recent arrival. This rather unfriendly looking plant is Xanthosium occidentalis, and it's a weed of rivers and wetlands. I'm not sure how the seed got up this far from the river. And it's actually a daisy, which is pretty amazing considering that the fruit is like a spiny burr. What we've got here is a little branch of black bluebush, Mariana pyramidata, and you can see that on this branch here, instead of ending in a fine tip, there's a lump, and that lump is formed by a gall. And what a gall is when an insect, usually a wasp, lays an egg into the growing tip, and when the egg hatches, the caterpillar has the capacity to change the way the plant grows around it. So if we just chop this open, we should be able to see a thickened sort of wall. You might not be able to see it, but there's clearly a fair bit of green in the middle there, and probably there are some tiny little caterpillars in there happily munching away, protected from the outside world. This plant here is an Atriplex, a saltbush, and saltbushes tolerate saline conditions, and they also excrete excess salt out of their leaves. And so if you taste one of the leaves, if you lick it, you'll often get a salty sensation. This particular one is called pop saltbush. It's Atriplex spongiosa, and it's called pop saltbush because it's got fruits that are like rice bubbles, little spongy puffballs with a seed in the middle.
I mentioned earlier that the expedition was important botanically because only some of the specimens that Beckler collected belonged to species that had already been named. And this is one of the species that had already been named before the expedition. Mueller had already named it, as you said, Atriplex spongiosa. Later on we'll see at least one species of Atriplex that wasn't named at the time of the expedition.
The plant we have here is another Atriplex. It's Atriplex limbata, and Atriplex limbata is characterised by these neat fruits that are like a fan on the end of a stalk, and that stalk is the limb of the flower, and that's how it got its name, to describe that part of the flower.
And this is an example of a species that was named and described from a specimen that Beckler collected somewhere in the vicinity of the Darling Depot camp.
Ben just asked me if there were any Beckler species out here, and apart from Atriplex spongiosa, which we'll look at in a minute, there's Bulbon lotta, which is one that he collected. And Bulbon lotta has yellow flowers, which are quite striking in this individual, and the inflorescence, so the flowering branch, the main flowering branch, has no secondary branches. Each flower comes off all around this single branch, single stem. So if you look at any of these stems, they've got no secondary branches on them. So that's an important characteristic of this species. This plant with a pretty pink flower is Aureum spicatum. Presumably it was one that would have attracted Beckler's eye when he collected it with the expedition. The plant we have here is Atriplex nummularia, another saltbush. This plant is a long-lived, one of the tallest of the saltbushes, and it was probably cultivated here where we are now at the old Kinchiga homestead. The homestead is quite close to the river on a billabong that was only filled when the river was in flood.
This was one of the Atriplex species that Beckler did collect somewhere in the vicinity of the Darling River, and it's a species that was named relatively early on in Australian botanical taxonomy. It was named in England, I think from a specimen that Major Mitchell collected, and that collection went back to England. So it's before Mueller starts naming so many species, Australian species.
This little plant here is Plantago Drummondii that Beckler collected. Plantagos are a very widespread family, and they're members of the Plantain family and the genus Plantago in eastern Australia and also elsewhere. And most people would know plantains from their own gardens, but this species is restricted to the drier parts of the continent. What I've got here is a hill which is like an island on the floodplain, so the soil's a little bit raised. And what I think's happened here is that there was an ant nest here, and this plant here that's now dead is a Sclerulina diacantha, which has a fruiting body that's attractive to ants. And so the ants would have taken one of these fruiting bodies back to their nest, and whether or not they were still here, there was enough moisture at some stage for this plant to establish. And what that's done is it's set up an environment for a whole lot of other plants to recruit above the level of the water when it was high. And so just looking around as we go around here, I'll just point out some of the plants that I can see. There's Tetragonia tetragonioides. There's Bulbon lotta that we've seen before, a few plants of it. Aureum spicatum, you can see some here with flowers on them. It's quite a pretty pink flower on it. Around here we've got Trigonella suavissima. This is another plant that Beckler collected. Phyllanthus lacunellus, a member of the Euphorbiaceae. This plant with the purple flower on it, Stemodia florulenta. It's actually a plant that tolerates quite a bit of flooding. There's some more sclerulinas around this side. Centipeda cunninghamii, another Beckler species. Pimelia. This Pimelia, I think, is Pimelia simplex. And on the other side of the island, of the hill, I can see a black box seedling. And this seedling probably arose from seeds that were floating on the water when it was flooded. And when the wind blew, it would have blown the seeds and a whole lot of other organic material, bits of leaf and bark and dead seeds, and blown them all around the edges where they would have been deposited. And then as the floodwaters receded, this would have germinated in the wet soil. Probably not from this most recent flood, but the one before. Although it's hard to tell how rapidly these things grow. This is a Eucalyptus largiflorens, which I think is also one that Beckler collected on the expedition. This plant here is a parasitic plant. It's Exocarpus aphyllus, and it's called Exocarpus aphyllus because it actually has more or less no leaves. So aphyllus means without leaves. The plant is a root parasite, so when the seeds germinate, they grow into the soil, usually at the base of another plant, in this case a black box, and the roots penetrate the roots of the host plant and get some of their nutrients and all of their water effectively from that. And this Exocarpus is actually in flower, and as you can tell, it's not very exciting to look at as a flower. They're just these little green blobs. And in fact there's even a young fruit growing there. Exocarpus have an edible fruit. This one's not ripe yet, but I don't think they're particularly tasty. The most distinctive species in this area is the Quondam, Santalum acuminatum, and you can see there's a large plant here underneath a dead black box tree, and Quondams are a semi-parasitic plant, so it would have established and connected some of its roots to that black box tree and then drawn its most of its water from the black box. Now that tree has subsequently died, but the Quondam survived, and all these other young Quondams that you can see around here are probably root suckers from that same plant. Okay, the plant is Stemodia florulenta, and it's got this blue flower with white markings on it, and I think they're designed, for want of a better word, to attract insects that tell them where to land, and there's a bee inside that flower foraging for nectar. It's just coming out now. It's getting ready for another flower, I think.